The pledges made by Kim Jong-un when he met President Trump at their summit in Singapore last month was the immediate return of the remains of US soldiers killed in the Korean War. However, after 5 weeks, it still hasn't been carried out. North Korea's intentions have been questioned after they stood up US officials for a scheduled meeting last week, then proceeded to demand a higher level of talks than the working level talks planned, to which the US duly complied. The return of the remains is finally set to take place next week, but if the process so far is anything to go by, further complications would not be a total surprise. We'll discuss this and more with a guest in the studio later, but first let's catch up on the latest headlines with Devin Whiting at the News Centre. Devin?
Hi, Jong-un. South Korea's ruling party and the government met today to gauge the impact of next year's minimum wage hike and other potential risks to the economy. To cope with the potential side effects, they've proposed a set of measures to improve the lives of society's most vulnerable. Kim Min-ji reports.
South Korea's ruling Democratic Party of Korea and the government are seeking a set of measures aimed at supporting people in the low-income bracket. The meeting between the two sides, which took place Tuesday, comes amid controversy over next year's almost 11% hike to the minimum wage, on top of the 16% increase this year. There are concerns that rather than helping the vulnerable, the wage hike actually puts a burden on small businesses due to increased labor costs, which has led to part-time workers losing their jobs.
There have been disputes regarding the minimum wage hike, but there's no doubt it will create a sustainable society by increasing the incomes of the most vulnerable. The government needs to be at the forefront to win the understanding of labour circles, the self-employed and small business owners. It also needs to quickly come up with measures to help low-income earners.
The party and the government have agreed to do this by firstly expanding the number of people eligible for Earned Income Tax Credit, a program that entails tax refunds for low-income households, as well as by raising financial support. The two sides also agreed to increase the basic pension for elderly people in the lowest 20% bracket to roughly $260 a month by next year, 2 years earlier than originally planned. Also in the package are employment subsidies for young people entering the job market for the first time, as well as job creation measures for senior citizens. The government is expected to unveil a comprehensive plan on Wednesday.
We'll work to expand the social safety net of those in the low-income bracket, as well as carry out reforms so that innovation can be seen across the economy. At the same time, we'll step up fiscal measures and preemptive action against internal and external risks.
The two sides also said they will soon come up with follow-up measures regarding the minimum wage hike. In the meantime, the ruling party also vowed all-out efforts to pass related bills, while the government has promised to draw up policies that bring about tangible changes the people can feel. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
The International Monetary Fund is keeping its original forecast for global economic growth unchanged this year, despite concerns over rising trade tensions and higher oil prices. However, they warn growth could be hurt by the trade war between the U.S. and China. Lee Seung-jae reports.
Despite the growing concerns over rising trade tensions and rising oil prices worldwide, the International Monetary Fund has left its global economic growth forecast unchanged at 3.9% for both 2018 and 2019, compared to its previous forecast issued back in April. According to the IMF's chief economist Maury Obstfeld, these projections only take into account tariffs currently in force, so larger actions such as possible automobile tariffs were not included. Despite the growth forecast being kept unchanged, Obstfeld added that growth momentum was slowing. While the IMF rounded down the growth projections to reach the 3.9% forecast in April, for the July forecast, the numbers were rounded up slightly to reach the same figure. The forecast for the two countries in middle of a huge trade spat were both unchanged as well, as the U.S. growth forecast was pegged at 2.9% in 2018 and 2.7% in 2019, while China's growth was forecast at 6.6% in 2018 and 6.4% in 2019. The IMF warns that the escalating trade conflict following the U.S. tariff actions threatened to derail the economic recovery and depress medium-term growth forecasts. taking into consideration the potential damage from the full brunt of President Trump's tariff threat, combined with the subsequent retaliation from trading partners, the annual global economic output may be reduced by 0.5% from projections for 2020. That translates to close to $500 billion in lost annual output based on IMF projections, which is the equivalent of subtracting an economy the size of Thailand. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin met on Monday to discuss a number of global issues, including North Korea. Putin praised Trump's efforts to get North Korea to denuclearize, while Trump welcomed close cooperation on the matter with Moscow. Kim Yo-sun has this report.
U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin sat down for a one-on-one meeting on Monday in Helsinki. The two leaders held private talks for nearly 4 hours in the Finnish capital, touching upon a wide range of issues, including trade, nuclear arms, and China. The denuclearization of the Korean peninsula was one of their key agenda items. President Trump said he briefed his Russian counterpart on the results of the first-ever North Korea-U.S. summit held in Singapore last month.
We also discussed one of the most critical challenges facing humanity, nuclear proliferation. I provided an update on my meeting last month with Chairman Kim on the denuclearization of North Korea, and after today, I am very sure that President Putin and Russia want very much to end that problem, going to work with us, and I appreciate that commitment.
Putin hailed Trump's efforts in settling the North's nuclear issue.
It's good that the issue of the Korean Peninsula started to resolve gradually. To a large extent, it became possible because President Trump personally got involved into the settlement, building the dialogue in the spirit of cooperation and not confrontation.
The two leaders also said Washington and Moscow must find ways to cooperate in the pursuit of shared interests. Following the summit aimed at resetting the two countries' frosty relations, President Trump said their bilateral ties, which have never been worse, had changed for the better as of about several hours ago. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, South Korea's unification ministry says it will work to expand and increase exchanges with the North, but at the same time communicate with the international community to make sure those don't violate international sanctions. It'll also push to revise some laws to make sure inter-Korean exchanges don't suddenly come to a stop without enough discussion. Oh Jung-hee reports.
Seoul will continue to expand inter-Korean exchanges and cooperation, but will make sure things remain within the framework of international sanctions, especially when it comes to railways, roads, and forestation projects. That's according to an unnamed official from South Korea's unification ministry on Tuesday. In a series of talks a few weeks ago, the two Koreas agreed to cooperate in linking and modernizing railways and roads, as well as conducting forestation projects in the north. For railways and roads, Seoul and Pyongyang agreed to begin with joint field inspections because bringing South Korea's resources and equipment into North Korea for construction could violate international sanctions. The Unification Ministry says forestation projects, too, could be a breach of sanctions. For example, setting up water control systems at tree nurseries. If the projects go so far as to involve technology transfers, the official says, South Korea will discuss these matters with the international community and the United States to make exceptions. He added that the North is well aware of the sanctions, and the two Koreas go through detailed discussions at their talks, taking the sanctions into account to arrive at an agreement. Meanwhile, Seoul will be making some legal changes as well to make sure inter-Korean interactions move forward steadily. Discussions will begin at South Korea's National Assembly on revising the Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation Act. One of these changes will be that when inter-Korean projects have to be restricted or prohibited, a cabinet meeting will have to be held, just to make sure decisions are made a little bit more prudently than when the inter-Korean Kaesong Industrial Complex was abruptly shut down in February 2016. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been on a series of field tours, and it seems he's been scolding a lot of workers and the authorities for being incompetent and irresponsible. Pyongyang's state-run Korean Central News Agency released 8 reports this morning of Kim giving field guidance at factories, construction sites, farms, and more. At an electric power plant construction site, Kim scolded workers for never being out in the field and his own cabinet for being all mouth. According to the agency, the power plant construction began 30 years ago but is still ongoing, and Kim was furious about how his cabinet never reported to him about critical measures needed to finish it. Kim also inspected a bag factory, a holiday camp, and a hotel construction site where he again criticized the pace of development and scolded the workers for their attitudes. Kim is seen as getting tough in order to push his 5-year economic development plan, which is due in 2020. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
When North Korean leader Kim Jong-un agreed to return the remains of US soldiers killed in North Korea during the Korean War, it was widely seen as a goodwill gesture to the US in their negotiations on denuclearization. But what was expected to have been a quick and painless affair has now dragged on for weeks with cancelled meetings, unmet expectations and protracted negotiations. If repatriating US remains is this tricky, how difficult will it be in getting the regime to hand over its nuclear weapons? Joining me in the studio to look at these issues further is Professor Kim Hyun-wook from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, sources say North Korea are getting ready to hand over the US remains, and next week, on the 27th of July, the anniversary of the Korean War armistice agreement. That's according to certain sources. Do you think it will finally now happen?
Yes, I think so. I think, North Korea, they came and recalled the meeting in the general level. I think the July 27th you mentioned is very meaningful date. It's the 65th anniversary of the armistice agreement. So I think for North Korea, this remains return to the United States is a very meaningful gesture. For now, there is very skeptical opinions rising in the United States, and I think North Korea might be worrying about whether Trump would suddenly break the frame of U.S.-North dialogue and negotiations. So I think the return of U.S. soldiers remains to the United States is meaningful because this is not something that is touching upon the denuclearization moves of North Korea, which I think is very sensitive to North Korea. But at the same time, by making these gestures, which takes a long time, North Korea can kind of entrap the U.S. in the frame. So that the U.S. would not walk out of the frame and make the frame put there and continue in the future, the negotiation between two countries.
I mean, returning remains, as you said, is perhaps easier than denuclearization. But at the same time, North Korea haven't been making it easy. I mean, they demanded general-level talks after abruptly cancelling, actually standing up the U.S. delegation that were waiting for them at Panmunjom. What do you make of North Korea's actions on this front?
The general level talk between the North Korea and the UN command has some meanings. In the past, the meeting has been used in order to talk and discuss about the maintenance of the armistice system in the Korean Peninsula. They have been talking about how not to intrude to each other, threaten each other in the general level meeting. So for North Korea, which has upgraded this meeting from the colonel level to general level, I think this is a very meaningful message from North Korea to the United States that North Korea seriously wants to use this meeting not only for the remains of U.S. soldiers remains returned to the United States, but also for talk about the declaration of the end of Korean War and possibly leading to the agreement of peace in the Korean Peninsula.
So you're saying they're using this return the remains as more than just returning the remains. They're trying to get other things out of it, which the working level talks wouldn't have been enough. But standing them up like that, couldn't they have just sent a message beforehand?
What's that?
couldn't they have just sent a message beforehand? They stood up the US delegation that came to Panmunjom. Why have these kind of actions that could cause animosity?
I think the U.S. and North Korea still have some tug of war about their positions. North Korea, when Secretary Pompeo visited Pyongyang, the U.S. Requested strongly that the North Korea needs to take steps for the initial measures for the denuclearization of North Korea. But at the same time, North Korea requested that some other measures of security of guarantee of North Korean regime should be given by the U.S. to North Korea first before North Korea takes some steps for denuclearization. But I think because of this tug of war, I think North Korea might be also thinking that maybe some other ways and steps might be necessary to bring the U.S. into the talk about the armistice and also the declaration of the end of war. At the same time, maybe North Korea might also consider some elite opinions, elite opinions in the United States. When Pompeo came back to the United States, the opinions in the United States was very critical. North Korea is still dragging some time, not taking the measures for denuclearization. The same pattern that North Korea has done before is repeated. So what is Trump government doing? Doing nothing about, bring North Korea into denuclearization. So maybe, some news media reported that when Pompeo reported some of the outcomes of his visit to Pyongyang to Trump, Trump was kind of considering what the pathway in the future should be. And they discussed, and the bottom line came out that let's take more time and take some more time for the negotiations, see what's going to happen in the future. So this means that Trump is kind of in the moment what he has to do, whether to continue this negotiation or break the frame and walk out of the frame of negotiations. So maybe North Korea knows this kind of situation in the United States and maybe needs some kind of measures to entrap the United States into the frame of negotiations.
You mentioned talking about the peace agreement, the end of war agreement that the North Korea might want as well. South Korea has also been putting pressure, it seems.
Sure.
President Moon has been talking about saying that he hopes that an end of war agreement is reached by the end of the year. Do you think the US will get on board?
Well, we don't really know about that. I mean, because Trump government's posture is very clear that he thinks that the sanctions should not be lifted before denuclearizations, and also some measures to guarantee the regime security of North Korea. For example, declaration of the end of the Korean War should be also something that would be made only after some measures of denuclearization is implemented. So so far the U.S. position is very clear. But interesting point is that ever since for example, last year and the early this year, the Trump government's position towards North Korea was very clear. The CVID first and later incentive. And then also talked about some Libyan model, which would, front-loading all the important nuclear warheads and ICBMs from the territory of North Korea into the United States. But all these kinds of detailed objective of denuclearization of North Korea has disappeared now. So Trump government's detailed policy to denuclearize North Korea has changed a lot from the past until the current moment. So maybe it's possible that Trump wants to keep the momentum of negotiations and might also modify its policies later on. But we'll see how it goes.
You say the talk of denuclearization has disappeared pretty much right now. Do you think it was a mistake by Trump to agree to returning the remains, agreeing to North Korea to return the remains when they met in Singapore? Because at the moment it seems like North Korea is using the return of the remains to do that first before to delay talk about denuclearization.
Something that we have to pay attention to is the contents of a joint statement in the summit meeting. The first point was about to establish the new relationship between two countries. Second point was about the denuclearization. Third was about the peace regime in the Korean Peninsula. So I think Trump's focus, of course, his priority is denuclearizing North Korea, but he thinks that there should be more efforts to build a new relationship between two countries, build the trust between two countries, which he thinks is a very important basis for the denuclearization of North Korea. And I think in that sense, the return of remains is very important policies. For example, U.S.-Vietnam relations. After the war in Vietnam, Vietnamese policy towards the United States to normalize the relationship has begun from returning the U.S. remains to the United States. So I think this could be a very good signals to North Korea that the U.S. is serious in remaking the relationship between two countries, which I think would be a very good basis for the denuclearization.
Meanwhile, in South Korea's defense ministry has announced today that military communication lines with North Korea have re-established now. Has been fully restored. How important a step do you think that is?
This is something that South Korea can do without sanctions lifted. I think the South Korean government is ready for a lot of significant policies to exchange between North and South Korea in economic terms. So-called new economic initiative is ready by the South Korean government. But unfortunately, the UN Security Council resolution sanctions on North Korea is now still going on. There has not been any lifting of sanctions of United Nations. So under the current situation, I think the only thing we can do is all the measures to restore the relationship. For example, restoring the communications line with North Korea, all these kind of things. So I think some significant meanings of all these measures by South Korea is that kind of pushing the U.S. into the frame, pushing the U.S. so that the U.S. would now walk away from the frame. And North and South Koreas are ready for all the kind of exchanges and communications and increasing contact with each other. So we are ready for denuclearization. We are ready for sanctions lifted. So I think this is some kind of very strong message to the President Trump, I think.
Okay, a couple of things before we go. Some news coming out from North Korea as well. There was an interesting piece in North Korean state media today, which revealed some of more of Kim Jong-un's movements. They said he toured the site of some construction sites. But what's interesting was he scolded the workers there. He called them incompetent and irresponsible, and he said he was speechless at the state of what was going on there. What do you make of that? Is this normal for Kim Jong-un to do something like this?
This is very new posture. I think comparing from the last year, and this year's policy of Kim Jong-un is completely different. Last year he was focusing on developing nuclear capabilities, achieving the level of nuclear power capabilities in North Korea, which I think was also very much contributed to his policy consolidation of Kim Jong-un. But this year, he's kind of switching his power from nuclear capability into economic development, so-called dual policies, and he's done with one side and he's moving into the other side. So all the policy gestures he's showing to the people of North Korea and also to international communities that he's now actually really focusing on economic policies. He's really giving a hard time to his bureaucrats because they are not focusing much on economic policies. Now Kim Jong-un, the leader, is now here to look at what's going on in the economic side and hydroelectric power station. But what are you doing? The bureaucrats really, dealing with all these, economic policy have not even come into this side. So that kind of showmanship is something I think would give a very significant message to the North Korean people that the leader Kim Jong-un is really seriously carrying the welfare of North Korean people.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I think we'll have to end it there, but thank you for coming in today and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you very much.
Now that concludes our show. I'll be back tomorrow with more analysis of the day's top stories. In the meantime, stay tuned to Arirang News for our later newscasts for the latest top stories from Korea and around the world. Thank you for watching and goodbye.